There are very few lives that manage to embody both the highest ideal of generosity and the darkest warning about human vulnerability at the same time. Brooke Astor's life did exactly that. To the public, she was the woman who saved New York. The benefactor who gave away hundreds of millions, who walked personally into homeless shelters, libraries, museums, and community centers, refusing to be a distant name on a plaque. To history, she became something else as well. A symbol of how wealth, status, and moral reputation collapse the moment the mind begins to fail. Brooke Astor was not simply rich. She was powerful in the most socially respected way possible. She was admired, trusted, celebrated. Presidents praised her. Mayors deferred to her. Cultural institutions survived because of her intervention. By the end of the 20th century, she was widely described as the conscience of New York's old money class, the proof that inherited wealth could still serve the public good. If money could buy safety, Brooke Astor should have been untouchable. But this story does not begin with her fall. It begins with a question that hangs over the entire arc of her life. What does wealth actually protect you from when you can no longer protect yourself? Brooke Astor understood suffering early. Long before philanthropy became her identity, violence shaped her private world. Her first marriage trapped her in years of abuse, humiliation, and fear. She escaped it physically, but not emotionally. That experience carved something permanent into her understanding of human cruelty. It may explain why she later devoted herself so fiercely to strangers in need. She knew how invisible pain could be. She knew how silence could imprison a person even inside luxury. Yet the same survival instincts that helped her endure abuse also hardened her. They shaped the way she loved, the way she withdrew, and the way she made choices that would echo for decades. Nowhere was that more visible than in her relationship with her only child, Anthony Marshall. From the moment he was born, that bond carried damage, resentment, and distance. A wound that never healed, only deepened with time. When Brooke married into the Astor fortune, the transformation was total. Money amplified her reach, her influence, and eventually her legend. She became the face of benevolent power, the woman who could pick up the phone and rescue an institution with a single decision. But power, even when exercised for good, reshapes relationships. It creates hierarchies. It creates silence. And it creates dependency. By the time Brooke Astor entered old age, she was surrounded by admiration but increasingly isolated in reality. The city saw a symbol. Her family saw access. And the law saw a woman who would soon need a guardian. That transition, from autonomous benefactor to legally vulnerable elder, would mark the most dangerous moment of her life. Because once Brooke Astor could no longer remember clearly, once she could no longer verify motives or intentions, the wealth that once empowered her became a weapon turned inward. And the person holding it was not a stranger, not a criminal, not an outsider. It was the one individual the law trusted most. Her son. This is where the myth ends. And the nightmare begins. To understand how Brooke Astor became vulnerable to such profound betrayal, it is necessary to confront the emotional architecture of her family life rather than the scale of her fortune. Wealth did not create the fracture between mother and son. It merely preserved it, widened it, and eventually gave it legal force. Anthony Marshall entered the world under circumstances already soaked in violence and resentment. His conception occurred during a marriage defined by abuse, fear, and humiliation. Brooke would later suggest that his very existence was tied to one of the darkest periods of her life. This was not something a child could ever undo, and it was not something a mother ever fully confronted. From the beginning, Anthony represented pain she wanted to escape rather than nurture. When Brooke remarried and rebuilt her life, she did so by leaving her son behind emotionally. Boarding schools replaced daily presence. New husbands replaced maternal attention. Stability for Brooke meant distance from the reminders of her first marriage, and Anthony was the most permanent reminder of all. As Brooke refined her identity as a sophisticated editor, social figure, and eventually philanthropist, her son became increasingly peripheral, an obligation rather than a priority. The second marriage brought genuine happiness, but it also reinforced Anthony's isolation. He was not adopted, not fully welcomed, not integrated into the new family structure. He learned early that affection was conditional and approval rare. By the time Brooke married Vincent Astor, the emotional exile became explicit. Vincent openly despised Anthony, and Brooke chose harmony with her powerful husband over loyalty to her child. The message was unmistakable. There was no place for him in the world she had chosen. Anthony responded by building a life of achievement that should, by any reasonable standard, have earned pride. Military service. Diplomatic appointments. Intelligence work. Cultural success. Yet none of it mattered. In Brooke's eyes, he remained a disappointment, a reminder of failure rather than proof of resilience. Their relationship hardened into a cycle of demand and denial. She summoned him, relied on him, and yet withheld the approval he spent his entire life seeking. This unresolved emotional debt became the foundation for everything that followed. When Brooke aged, the roles reversed in a way that felt almost inevitable. Anthony did not simply gain authority over his mother. He inherited decades of bitterness, rejection, and unspoken grievance, now paired with absolute legal power. The arrival of Charlene Gilbert intensified this dynamic rather than creating it. She did not invent Anthony's resentment. She validated it. She reframed it as injustice. She gave language to what he had felt all his life. That his mother had given everything to strangers and almost nothing to him. That generosity had flowed outward while affection had been rationed at home. As Brooke's cognitive decline began, the shift was subtle but decisive. Memory faltered. Judgment softened. Repetition replaced clarity. Yet outwardly, the symbol remained intact. Society still saw a centenarian philanthropist, elegant and revered. Internally, control had already passed to her son. Diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, Brooke became legally dependent at precisely the moment when dependence was most dangerous. Anthony concealed the diagnosis. Not out of concern for dignity, but out of strategy. As long as the world believed Brooke was still fully capable, no one would question the decisions made in her name. Contracts could be signed. Assets could be redirected. Authority could be exercised quietly, incrementally, and legally. What followed was not a sudden act of cruelty but a methodical dismantling of comfort, dignity, and independence. The woman who had shaped New York's cultural landscape began living as though resources were scarce. Familiar pleasures vanished. Trusted staff were dismissed. Medical care was reduced. Social access was restricted. Every decision moved in one direction, toward isolation and dependency. This was not neglect born of ignorance. It was control enforced through bureaucracy. Nurses were instructed not to call emergency services. Doctors were limited. Friends were discouraged. The environment itself became hostile, dim, unclean, stripped of warmth. Brooke Astor did not simply lose her autonomy. She lost her humanity in small, daily ways that accumulated into something unrecognizable. Anthony did not see this as abuse. He saw it as settlement. A balancing of accounts decades in the making. To him, this was not exploitation. It was justice delayed. And that belief made the cruelty sustainable, even rational. By the time outsiders began to sense that something was wrong, the damage was already deep. Brooke Astor, once the most protected woman in New York, had become invisible inside her own life. Not because she lacked money, but because the person controlling it no longer saw her as a mother, only as a resource. And in that transformation, the final stage of the tragedy quietly took hold. The true horror of Brooke Astor's final years did not lie in dramatic violence or sudden catastrophe. It unfolded slowly, through routine decisions that stripped away dignity one layer at a time. This was suffering administered through paperwork, authority, and silence. And because it was legal, it went unnoticed far longer than anyone imagined possible. As Brooke's Alzheimer's progressed, her world contracted. What had once been a life of movement, conversation, and purpose narrowed into a single apartment on Park Avenue. Yet even that sanctuary became a place of quiet deprivation. She no longer slept in her bed but on a sofa soaked with the smell of dog urine. Her clothes were torn and frayed. Nurses were forced to turn her nightgowns inside out to hide the worst damage. This was not poverty. This was deprivation imposed in the presence of extraordinary wealth. Her beloved dogs, once companions she adored, were locked away in a pantry, separated from her without explanation. When they were briefly released, the apartment descended further into filth, yet staff were forbidden from properly cleaning. Food was reduced to bland purees, peas and carrots and oatmeal, served not for medical necessity but for convenience and control. The French chef who once prepared meals worthy of her taste and status was dismissed to save money that Brooke did not need to save. Small requests were denied with chilling consistency. Nurses asked for inexpensive non-skid socks to prevent falls. The cost was trivial. The refusal was absolute. They paid for them themselves. A new dress for her birthday was deemed unnecessary. Face creams were replaced with petroleum jelly. Medical visits were limited. Medications were adjusted downward. Falls occurred. A bed with safety rails was refused. Each decision, isolated, might have seemed minor. Together, they formed a system designed to erase comfort. The most devastating act, however, was symbolic as much as financial. Brooke's favorite painting, Child Hassam's Flags, Fifth Avenue, had hung above her fireplace for decades. It represented her love for New York, for beauty, for continuity. As her judgment faltered, Anthony told her she could not afford new clothes unless the painting was sold. It was a lie constructed to exploit confusion and fear. Brooke believed it. She agreed. The painting sold for $10 million. Anthony took a massive commission. The dealer later resold it for far more. Brooke lost the artwork she cherished most and gained nothing in return. Even worse, the transaction was accompanied by blatant tax manipulation, inflating the original purchase price to reduce capital gains. This was not desperation. It was calculated extraction. At the same time, Anthony moved to erase Brooke's final wishes. Holly Hill, the estate where she had long said she wanted to spend her last days, was shut down. Staff who protested were fired. Gardens she loved were destroyed under the claim that they caused emotional pain. Friends who had known her for decades found access increasingly restricted. Visits became difficult, then rare, then almost impossible. What makes this phase of the story particularly disturbing is how easily it could have continued until her death without intervention. Brooke Astor was isolated, confused, and legally powerless. Her reputation shielded her abuser, because no one could imagine that someone so admired could be living in such conditions. The myth of her invulnerability worked against her. The turning point came not from institutions, but from family. Her grandson, Philip Marshall, began to see what others could not. During visits, he noticed fear, confusion, and neglect that could not be explained by illness alone. He saw the environment. He heard the restrictions. He sensed control masquerading as care. Philip faced a choice that defined the moral core of the entire story. He could remain silent and preserve his inheritance, his relationship with his father, and his own stability. Or he could act, knowing that exposing the truth would destroy his family and cost him everything. He chose action. In July 2006, Philip filed a guardianship petition that stunned New York society. The allegations were detailed, specific, and horrifying. Neglect. Financial exploitation. Isolation. Abuse. Powerful figures stepped forward in support. Friends, financiers, former officials, people who had known Brooke Astor as both benefactor and friend, confirmed what Philip described. The court acted quickly. Emergency guardianship was granted. Anthony was stripped of authority. Financial control was transferred. Brooke was hospitalized briefly, then moved to Holly Hill, which was restored and staffed with genuine care. For the final year of her life, she lived surrounded by beauty, kindness, and dignity. It was a rescue, but it came late. The legal consequences that followed would dominate headlines, but they were almost secondary to the truth revealed. Brooke Astor's suffering was not an accident. It was the outcome of a system that places absolute trust in family without sufficient safeguards, and of a lifetime of unresolved emotional damage that found its final expression when power shifted. By the time Brooke died at 105, she had regained some peace, but the damage was irreversible. The city mourned. The institutions she saved honored her. And beneath the tributes lay a lesson far more unsettling than any courtroom verdict. Wealth does not protect the vulnerable. Love left unexamined can become cruelty. And sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from the people the law assumes will care the most. When the legal system finally intervened in Brooke Astor's life, it did more than rescue a single woman from abuse. It peeled back the facade of privilege and exposed how easily cruelty can hide behind respectability. The case that followed was not treated as a private family dispute. It became a public reckoning with the idea that wealth and lineage confer moral safety. They do not. The criminal investigation launched by the Manhattan District Attorney revealed a pattern far more deliberate than even Brooke's closest friends had suspected. Prosecutors did not describe Anthony Marshall's actions as mismanagement or misguided care. They called it what it was: a systematic scheme to defraud a vulnerable elder. Over the final years of Brooke's life, while her cognitive capacity collapsed, Anthony used his legal authority to enrich himself aggressively and reshape her legacy for his own benefit. Evidence showed that his annual compensation exploded upward once Brooke could no longer comprehend financial decisions. What had been a high but defensible salary multiplied several times over, reaching levels that defied any reasonable justification. At the same time, legal documents appeared that dramatically altered Brooke's will. Codicils redirected tens of millions of dollars away from charities she had supported for decades and into Anthony's control. The timing was critical. Each change occurred when her Alzheimer's had already stripped her of informed consent. The most damning moment came when handwriting experts examined the signatures on these documents. Hundreds of authentic Brooke Astor signatures were compared against the contested codicil. The conclusion was unequivocal. The signature was not hers. It was too smooth, too controlled, too consistent. It bore the marks of tracing, not authorship. In that moment, the narrative shifted from moral outrage to criminal certainty. The trial that followed became a spectacle precisely because of who Brooke Astor was. Figures rarely seen in criminal courtrooms took the stand. Cultural leaders, media icons, former diplomats. Each testified not only about financial details, but about Brooke's character, her habits, her values, and the unmistakable decline they had witnessed. Their presence made a powerful statement. This was not gossip. This was a collapse of trust at the highest social level. Anthony Marshall was convicted on 14 felony counts, including grand larceny and conspiracy. His attorney was convicted alongside him. The verdict sent shockwaves through New York's elite circles, where family privacy had long functioned as an unspoken shield. The message was clear. Lineage does not excuse exploitation. Yet even in conviction, the outcome felt unsettlingly incomplete. Anthony served only a brief period in prison before being released for medical reasons. He died years later without expressing remorse. For many observers, justice felt symbolic rather than proportional. The law had spoken, but it had spoken late, and the harm it addressed could never be fully undone. The financial consequences were more decisive. The courts invalidated the fraudulent codicils and restored Brooke's original intentions. The vast majority of her estate flowed to the institutions she had supported throughout her life. Museums, libraries, educational programs, and cultural foundations received the funds she had envisioned as her lasting contribution. In death, Brooke Astor regained control of her legacy in a way she had lost in life. Perhaps the most morally significant aftermath, however, belonged to Philip Marshall. Having sacrificed his inheritance and family ties, he did not retreat into anonymity. He transformed his experience into advocacy, dedicating himself to elder justice and awareness. His actions reframed the story. This was no longer only about betrayal. It was about responsibility, courage, and the cost of intervention. Brooke Astor's gravestone carries the inscription she chose. "I had a wonderful life." Those words have been debated ever since. Some see them as tragic irony. Others see forgiveness. What is certain is that they force an uncomfortable reflection. A life can be extraordinary and still end in profound failure of care. Generosity to the world does not guarantee kindness at home. And the systems designed to protect the vulnerable often activate only after irreversible damage has occurred. This case altered how elder abuse was discussed in the United States. It demonstrated that abuse does not require poverty, ignorance, or isolation. It can exist inside penthouses, among diplomats, within families celebrated for refinement and philanthropy. It thrives where power is concentrated and oversight is absent. Brooke Astor's story endures not because of the money she gave away, but because of the warning she left behind. Aging strips away illusion. It reveals the structures beneath our lives. Who holds authority? Who benefits from silence? And who is willing to intervene when doing so demands sacrifice? In the end, Brooke Astor saved New York many times over. She did not save herself. And that truth, more than any verdict or donation, defines the legacy that still unsettles those who hear her story. In the years since Brooke Astor's death, her story has settled into something far more complex than a tale of crime or punishment. It has become a mirror, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about aging, power, and the fragile illusion of security. What happened to her was not an anomaly. It was an extreme example of a vulnerability that exists quietly in millions of lives, hidden behind doors that appear respectable from the outside. Brooke Astor spent decades believing that purpose could protect her. She believed that if she remained useful, admired, and morally relevant, she would remain safe. In many ways, that belief defined her identity. She did not retreat into passive wealth. She worked relentlessly. She stayed visible. She stayed engaged. Even into her late 90s, she appeared at events, hosted gatherings, and represented continuity between old New York and the modern city she helped shape. But usefulness is not the same as safety. Visibility is not the same as protection. And moral capital does not translate into legal defense once autonomy disappears. When Brooke Astor lost cognitive clarity, she crossed an invisible threshold that no amount of goodwill could reverse. From that moment forward, her life was no longer governed by intention, but by control. This is the central lesson of her story. Elder abuse does not begin with cruelty. It begins with unchecked authority. It begins when one person holds legal power over another who can no longer challenge decisions, ask the right questions, or recognize manipulation. It thrives not because no one cares, but because everyone assumes someone else is watching. Brooke's suffering exposed a flaw deeply embedded in modern society. Families are trusted by default. Courts hesitate to interfere. Institutions assume affection where none may exist. And wealth creates a false sense of immunity, convincing outsiders that mistreatment cannot possibly be occurring. In reality, wealth can worsen abuse by increasing the incentives for exploitation and masking it behind comfort and discretion. What makes this case particularly haunting is that the warning signs were present long before the crisis. Emotional distance. Unresolved resentment. A lifetime of conditional love. These were not secrets. They were simply ignored, rationalized, or deemed private. Brooke Astor's tragedy was not only that she was abused. It was that the emotional groundwork for that abuse had been laid over decades without intervention or reflection. Her philanthropy, once seen purely as virtue, also takes on a more ambiguous meaning in hindsight. She gave endlessly to institutions, causes, and strangers, yet struggled to give emotional security to the one person closest to her. This imbalance does not negate her generosity, but it complicates it. It suggests that even the most outwardly compassionate lives can conceal profound failures of connection. Anthony Marshall's actions were criminal, but they were also deeply human in their origin. They emerged from long-buried grievance, from a son who never felt chosen, never felt seen, and never felt forgiven. That does not excuse what he did. It explains why it happened. And without understanding that distinction, society risks repeating the same mistakes under different names and faces. Philip Marshall's choice offers a counterweight to this darkness. His decision reminds us that moral clarity often comes at a personal cost. Intervention is rarely rewarded in the moment. It fractures families, destroys comfort, and invites public scrutiny. Yet without people willing to step forward, systems fail by default. Brooke Astor's final year of dignity existed only because someone was willing to sacrifice his own future to protect her present. Today, elder justice advocates frequently cite Brooke Astor's case as a turning point. Laws were reconsidered. Awareness increased. But awareness alone is not prevention. The deeper challenge remains cultural. How society talks about aging. How families confront resentment. How power is distributed and monitored when vulnerability increases. Brooke Astor's gravestone declares that she had a wonderful life. Perhaps she did. But her story insists that a wonderful life does not guarantee a gentle ending. It insists that dignity must be actively protected, not assumed. And it leaves behind a final, unsettling truth. The measure of a society is not how it celebrates its icons in their prime, but how it safeguards them when they can no longer speak for themselves. That is the legacy Brooke Astor could not control. And it is the responsibility she unknowingly passed to everyone who hears her story. Brooke Astor's story does not truly end with court verdicts or redistributed wealth. Its final meaning lives in the quiet spaces it leaves behind, in the questions that remain unresolved long after justice has been formally declared. What lingers is not only what was done to her, but what her life reveals about the fragile contract between autonomy and care. At the heart of this story is a paradox that modern society struggles to face. We celebrate independence as the highest form of dignity, yet we are all moving toward a stage of life where independence inevitably erodes. The transition from self-determination to dependence is not marked by a single moment. It happens gradually, invisibly, often without ceremony. And in that gradual shift, protections designed for clarity fail those who live in confusion. Brooke Astor's decline did not announce itself dramatically. It appeared in repetition, in hesitation, in moments of disorientation that could be dismissed as age rather than danger. Those around her, accustomed to her strength and authority, struggled to accept that the woman they knew no longer existed in the same way. That denial created space. And space became opportunity. What makes this especially unsettling is how well-intentioned systems contributed to her vulnerability. Guardianship laws are designed to protect. Family trust is presumed to be nurturing. Privacy is respected to avoid intrusion. In Brooke's case, each of these principles became a blindfold. They delayed scrutiny. They discouraged intervention. They allowed abuse to masquerade as care until evidence became overwhelming. Her case forces a reckoning with the assumption that family love is inherently safe. Love can coexist with resentment. Care can coexist with control. And obligation can become a weapon when it is backed by legal authority. Brooke Astor was not betrayed by strangers. She was betrayed by familiarity, history, and unresolved emotional debt. There is also a deeper reflection on how society values the elderly once their usefulness fades. Brooke Astor was revered when she was active, decisive, and visible. When she could no longer contribute, she became manageable rather than cherished. This shift is subtle but pervasive. It reflects a broader discomfort with aging that prioritizes efficiency over empathy and control over compassion. Her philanthropy, viewed through this lens, becomes even more poignant. She spent her life preserving institutions that outlast individuals. Libraries, museums, parks, public spaces. She believed in permanence. Yet she underestimated how temporary personal power can be, how quickly control can slip away when memory fails. The irony is painful. A woman who understood legacy better than most lost control of her own life when legacy mattered most. Brooke Astor's final year, rescued though it was, cannot erase the years of neglect that preceded it. But it does offer a glimpse of what dignity looks like when care is genuine. Beauty restored. Familiar spaces reopened. Voices that spoke to her as a person rather than a problem. These elements did not cure her illness, but they returned something essential. Recognition. That recognition is what elder abuse ultimately denies. It reduces a human being to an asset, a burden, or a liability. It strips away narrative and replaces it with administration. Brooke Astor's suffering was not defined solely by physical discomfort. It was defined by erasure. By being managed instead of understood. Her story compels a broader cultural response. One that asks how societies prepare for cognitive decline not just medically, but ethically. How conversations about aging happen before crisis, not after. How emotional histories within families are acknowledged rather than buried. How oversight is normalized rather than feared. If there is a final lesson to be drawn, it is this. Protection cannot rely on reputation. It cannot depend on wealth. And it cannot be postponed until clarity is lost. It must be built early, deliberately, and with the uncomfortable awareness that love alone is not enough. Brooke Astor's life was extraordinary. Her ending was not. And in that contrast lies the power of her story. It warns that dignity is fragile, that trust must be examined, and that the most dangerous moment in any life may come not with failure or loss, but with quiet dependence. What remains now is choice. Whether to treat her story as an isolated tragedy, or as a call to reshape how vulnerability is recognized and protected. Brooke Astor could no longer choose. But those who hear her story still can. Brooke Astor's story endures because it refuses to settle into a single meaning. It is not only a cautionary tale about elder abuse, nor is it simply a tragedy of family betrayal. It is a confrontation with the limits of power, wealth, and reputation, and with the uncomfortable truth that none of them can substitute for protection once autonomy is gone. In life, Brooke Astor mastered influence. She shaped cities, rescued institutions, and redirected the moral compass of American philanthropy. Yet her final years revealed a reality that influence could not override. Control, when transferred, does not carry moral memory. Legal authority does not remember generosity. Systems do not account for love lost or resentment accumulated. They execute power exactly as written, not as intended. Her story also exposes a collective failure. Friends sensed something was wrong. Staff noticed decline. Society admired from a distance. But intervention came late because it required crossing a boundary few are willing to cross. The boundary between respecting privacy and challenging abuse. Between trusting family and questioning it. Between preserving comfort and risking conflict. Brooke Astor fell into that space where hesitation becomes harm. There is no simple villain here, even though crimes were committed. Anthony Marshall's actions were indefensible, but they were rooted in a lifetime of emotional deprivation and unresolved grievance. Brooke's choices as a mother were not malicious, but they carried consequences she never imagined. This is what makes the story so unsettling. The catastrophe was not sudden. It was assembled slowly, through neglect, avoidance, and silence on all sides. Philip Marshall's intervention offers a final counterpoint. His decision reminds us that ethical action often demands sacrifice without guarantee of recognition or reward. He acted not because success was assured, but because inaction had become unbearable. In doing so, he restored dignity to his grandmother and exposed a truth larger than their family. That silence is never neutral. It always favors power. Brooke Astor's gravestone reads, "I had a wonderful life." Those words stand as both affirmation and indictment. They affirm a life of impact, purpose, and generosity. They indict a system that allowed such a life to end in isolation and neglect. The tension between those meanings is precisely why her story remains relevant. Ultimately, Brooke Astor's legacy is not defined solely by the money she gave away or the institutions that bear her name. It is defined by the warning she left behind. Aging is not a moral failure. Dependence is not a weakness. But unchecked power over the dependent is a danger that demands vigilance. Her story asks one final question of those who hear it. When autonomy fades, who truly holds responsibility? The law? The family? The community? Or the individual who chooses to act when silence is easier? The answer to that question determines whether Brooke Astor's suffering was merely observed, or whether it becomes the catalyst for change.